Hello, thanks for joining us today. I'm Robbie McLaren, a partner in the corporate department of Latham & Watkins.
I'm Farah O'Brien, and I'm a partner in the corporate department of Latham & Watkins.
Today we're discussing carve-out M&A transactions. We'll start by exploring the drivers and key trends in carve-out deals, and then look in particular at purchase price mechanics, which is a critical consideration on deals such as this. We'll wrap up by looking at the key issues for deal teams to consider and reflect on whether carve-outs will continue to be a significant part of the M&A market. Farah, carve-out transactions aren't new to the market. Why do you think we're seeing so many more of them today?
That's a really good question, because we are certainly seeing more of them, and that's not only across Europe but across the US and globally. I think there are two key reasons for that. One, I think, is the increase in activist investors. So boards of large corporates are either being pushed by activist investors, or in their business plan model they are planning to avoid any issues around activist investors. And so often these investors are pushing boards to divest of non-core assets and really focus, particularly where you've got a very large global corporate, to focus on their core businesses. The other key reason, one that we are much more involved with as lawyers, is increasing regulation, and again that's across the globe. And not only increasing regulation from governments, but also actually an increasingly interventionist approach from regulators. Many large transactions are being approved but subject to divestment conditions, which is then leading to carve-out transactions. Carve-out transactions have always been very complex. They are generally much more complex than a straightforward sale, and there's a number of reasons for that. My sense of the transactions that we've been working on is that they are becoming increasingly more complex. In your experience, what are the reasons why?
I think it's sort of tied to the point you talked about, the nature of regulation. It's becoming increasingly sophisticated, and there's a fear within the national regulators that they're being left behind by the increasing globalization of key sectors of the economy around payments, around use of personal data, and then things around messaging and communications. And as a result, they are using, I say, blunt tools that are perhaps not necessarily well suited to regulate these new business models. Mm-hmm. And as a consequence, the impact on the regulation is becoming unclear, and therefore I think we're seeing unprofitable markets or markets in which these new business models don't work being divested. That comes with its own complexity as well. Separately, as the economy has globalized, there are a potentially limitless number of structuring options available to multinationals to either play the regulatory arbitrage or to work with national tax systems. And as a result, when you plan a business to work through all of those various different rules, to extract one part of it from it becomes unbelievably complicated. And until we see some kind of national action, especially on the tax rules, that's not going to change in the foreseeable future. I think one of the sort of interesting things that at least I'm seeing in the market is that, notwithstanding there is this huge amount of increased complexity in doing deals like this, it had always been thought that most private equity funds or private equity sponsors were not terribly interested in doing these really complex cross-border carve-out transactions. But the contrary has been the experience, in that we're seeing more and more of the financial sponsors take on these complex deals. Any thoughts, Farah, as to why you think private equity sponsors are more interested in these kind of deals?
So a couple of reasons. I think one, in Europe we have for many years now really had very much a seller's market on transactions. And so in the private equity space, if you have a standard auction process for a secondary buyout, those processes are incredibly competitive. Many private equity sponsors feel that they are being pushed to pay higher prices, obviously when you've got increased competition. And as we've all heard as well, within the market there are kind of record levels of dry powder. So you've got a lot of private equity sponsors looking at a much smaller group of assets. And so I think sponsors are having to be more creative around the transactions that they look at. And one of the ways to do that is to approach corporates with ideas as to transactions that they might do, and also to look at transactions which they may have not done previously. On these large carve-out transactions, there's a lot of value that private equity can create as well. And I think the more times people look at these complex carve-out transactions, they become more familiar with the issues that arise around separation, around how you actually do the carve-out and then how you transition. One thing that we are seeing as well a lot in the market at the moment, which you wouldn't have seen a number of years ago, is also private equity sponsors teaming up with strategics on carve-outs, because you have the strategic who obviously has the operational and the business knowledge.
I mean, one of the key tensions that we always see on carve-out deals is the sort of conflict between a private equity seller or whoever is the seller wanting to use the kind of lockbox structure to try and minimize risk on a divestment. Yeah. But historically, we've never seen those used so much in carve-out deals because, you know, it's quite difficult. You know, how do you see those two interact?
You're right to say that typically you wouldn't use a lockbox on a carve-out transaction. The lockbox was created by the private equity community in order to deal with the complexities around completion accounts. Completion accounts which give the buyer the ability to adjust the equity value post-closing to reflect the actual price of the business at closing. Completion accounts, whilst they give the buyer additional protection, they are very complex and they can take often years to resolve. The lockbox has the benefit of simplicity. You agree your equity price based on a price as at the lockbox date, which is prior to signing, and then you effectively lock the business in terms of there being no cash flows out of the business or no leakage to the seller between the lockbox date up until when you close the transaction. Now that's very complex on a carve-out transaction because in a large corporate with a retained group, seller and also a target group, there will often be payments that will need to be made between both groups, and so it's very difficult in that type of a scenario to diligence the types of payments that you should be comfortable with being made between the lockbox date and closing. We are seeing lockbox being used more on carve-out transactions, but it doesn't come without its risks. So if we look forward to the M&A market over the next couple of years, do you think that we're going to be seeing the same number of carve-out transactions and a continuing increase in complexity of carve-out transactions?
Yes, I think we will see an increasing use of carve-outs. I think carve-outs play an important role in the M&A market throughout the economic cycle, and I think that's going to continue to be the case. I mean, recently we saw the acquisition by AbbVie of Allergan, and the experience of the last 2 to 3 years has always been that after these large deals there is a huge amount of divestitures of non-core businesses, and those will always be done by carve-outs. Looking forward beyond this cycle, but to the extent we get to an economic downturn with restructurings and other refocusing of businesses, they will all generate M&A activity which will have to be done through way of sort of complex carve-outs. I don't at the moment see any change in the regulatory landscape, both on the tax front and also in the antitrust or national security concerns. So you layer that on top of the existing business models, and I think unfortunately deals are only going to get more complicated.
I absolutely agree. Thank you so much, Robbie, for sharing your experiences and your insight with me today. It's been really interesting.
And thanks to you, Farah, for your insights, and it's been great talking to you too. These issues and many more are explored in a forthcoming book contributed by a number of Latham & Watkins partners on carve-out M&A transactions, which is published by Global on Business. Thanks very much for watching.